Hi, welcome to our policy proposal, Rethinking U.S. Arctic Policy, a broad-based approach. In the following slides, we'll be detailing our policy proposal as well as the various dynamics at play in U.S. Arctic policy. The Alaskan Arctic is one of the most beautiful and fascinating regions in the United States. Too often, however, development in the Arctic has been marked by acrimonious conflicts between local communities, environmental organizations, and oil and gas companies. While there are serious risks to Arctic oil drilling, a new policy approach is necessary to shift away from a winner-take-all model of Arctic policy to a more harmonious policy strategy that accounts for all the interests at play in the Arctic. Our policy proposal has three main pillars: targeted environmental protections that take care of the most vulnerable and important of Arctic species, large-scale investments in infrastructure like icebreaker ships, as well as investments in local communities, and finally, revamping and focusing on oil spill prevention and cleanup methods that can help minimize the risk of oil drilling. Ultimately, the goal is to have an Arctic policy that works for everyone and establishes a sustainable future in the region. According to the National Snow and Ice Data Center, January 2017 marked the low of Arctic ice sea extent. The extent for January 2017 averaged 13.38 million square kilometers, the lowest January extent in the 38-year satellite record. Since the start of the most recent freeze season on October 1st, Arctic temperatures have been remarkably mild, contributing to the record low ice levels seen in January. Satellite data show that over the past 30 years, Arctic sea ice cover has declined by 30% in September, the month that marks the end of the summer melt season. Dirk Notz, a climate scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Germany, and Julian Strove, a climate scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, concluded in the 2016 study that there is a very clear relationship between carbon dioxide emissions and Arctic sea ice retreat in September, the critical month in which sea ice extent reaches its yearly minimum. According to the study, Strove and Notz calculated that the average American is responsible for yearly carbon emissions that lead to melting around 538 square feet, or 50 square meters, of September sea ice. If 1,000 billion more metric tons of carbon dioxide enter the air, there's a clear threat that the Arctic will be free of sea ice for most of September. At the current rate, the Arctic will be ice-free during September in about 29 years. According to the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, Arctic temperatures have increased by 2 degrees Celsius over a 50-year period. Temperatures in the Arctic have risen more than the rest of the globe. This can be attributed to the feedback loop that occurs when Arctic sea ice melts. Arctic sea ice, white in color, reflects a large proportion of the solar radiation that hits it. As the ice melts and darker colored waters are exposed, more radiation is absorbed and less is reflected, causing additional heating that causes additional melting ad infinitum. Additionally, the increased greenhouse gas effect from fossil fuel combustion causes the Earth to be better insulated from outgoing heat. The increased greenhouse gas insulation causes the coldest places to warm the most. This is called polar amplification. This effect can be seen in the extreme on Venus, where an intense concentration of greenhouse gases causes the poles to be effectively the same temperature as the tropics. On Earth, polar amplification causes the Arctic to warm approximately 3 times faster than the global average. This exacerbates the warming trend that is causing rapid melting in the Arctic. The environmental and economic costs of drilling in the Arctic are intertwined. First, oil drilling increases the fossil fuel supply and contributes to the release of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. As referenced earlier, carbon dioxide emissions directly correlate to a decrease in Arctic sea ice, and shrinking sea ice contributes to global warming. The environmental and economic costs of global warming are of an enormous magnitude. Moreover, in the wake of a catastrophic oil spill, local biodiversity would be severely impacted. As noted by the chart, the Arctic food chain relies on a range of organisms for it to subsist, including smaller organisms all the way to polar bears. Research has shown that the phytoplankton and zooplankton, the cornerstone species of this system, react poorly to even the tiniest of spills. Even small amounts of oil could lead the disruption of this to collapse the entire system and thus biodiversity in the region of the whole. Increased investment in Arctic drilling has the ability to lead to a lower cost of oil, but the risks associated with this investment are notable. In 2015, Shell abandoned their exploratory well in the Chukchi Sea when they decided it was no longer a feasible project. This was a $7 billion investment done over a decade. Shell's failure epitomizes the key challenge of Arctic oil drilling. It is very expensive to recover, and the continually dropping price of oil makes these huge investments unfeasible and extremely risky. Additionally, the cost of extracting a barrel of Arctic oil is much more expensive than the cost for bent crude oil. According to IHS Energy, a global oil and gas consultancy, the price per barrel for a barrel of Arctic oil needs to be at least $100 to break even, compared to the $50 price per barrel needed to break even for a barrel of Brent oil. Despite the fluctuation in bent crude oil, the cost of extracting Arctic oil reflects a higher price per barrel compared to the price of Brent crude oil. The underlying foundation for any policy regarding leases for oil drilling is the 1953 Outer Continental Shelf Act, which established some key premises for how exploitation of natural resources can occur in U.S. waters. Specifically, in Section 12A, it allows the President of the United States to declare that some lands simply will not be on the table for potential leases. In October of last year, President Obama did just that regarding the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas, declaring that those waters will no longer be available for leases. The Department of Interior under the Obama administration argued that because of the market conditions and biodiversity of the Arctic region, leases were not warranted. In effect, many environmentalist groups and legal experts claim that this move is permanent because the law does not contain provisions for the reversal of such an action, unless such a law is revised by Congress. As of now, the federal government has only one lease in Alaska, which is located in the Cook Inlet on the southern coast of Alaska. Congressional Republicans did not agree with the president's policy to stop oil leases in the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas. They argued that there are important economic benefits to be reaped from oil drilling leases. Recent economic analysis suggests that 55,000 jobs could be created from expanding oil leases in the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas. Republicans also argue that prohibiting oil exploration in the Arctic would be a show of geopolitical weakness towards Russia, who has become more active in the area. Republicans fear that an unchecked Russia in the Arctic would be an irresponsible concession of American leadership. In terms of the local indigenous communities, their relationship with oil drilling in the Arctic is not so clear-cut. Although initially they had some serious environmental concerns, and they still do, many indigenous communities have come to rely on the royalties from oil drilling ventures to fund their communities and to build vital infrastructure. Any serious policy proposal regarding whether or not to continue Arctic drilling should take into account how indigenous communities might be impacted and what other policies can be put in place to help those communities. As you can see from the picture, there are currently 15 planning areas around Alaska. The Beaufort and Chukchi Seas are two of those. Due to low interest and unprofitability of the region, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has decided to remove these two planning areas from the 2017-2022 federal leasing plan. The federal government still has one lease in the Cook Inlet of Alaska scheduled for June 2017. Environmental groups such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Greenpeace, and the National Congress of American Indians are proponents of increased regulation, saying that by limiting offshore drilling, local native villages, coastal communities, and the marine life of the region will be better protected from potential oil spills that could be costly and difficult to clean. These same groups argue that a temporary fix on a limited supply of oil is not enough to justify putting the environment at risk, especially when there is currently limited infrastructure in place to clean up after an oil spill, and the process is much more difficult in the colder climates. Despite these concerns, many businesses and native communities are concerned that by not allowing drilling in the region, the future well-being and economic stability of the people and region may be in danger. They argue that the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 allows for them to receive some returns on the profit that drilling creates. Similarly, local government officials argue that taking away from the drilling will cripple industry and also not allow for funds to be allocated to improve local roads and schools. These officials, as well as the president and CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, also argue that increased regulations allow Russia free rein over the drilling in the area and puts the U.S. at a serious competitive disadvantage without a strong Arctic program. There are a variety of policy proposals that are worth considering when deciding upon a policy strategy for the Arctic that tries to make all sides happy. Given the current political context that is friendly towards oil interests, a compromise that allows for some oil drilling but also accounts for local environmental concerns is sorely needed. In terms of the drilling itself, our policy proposal includes a limiting of the federal drilling ban to specific areas in the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas that are environmentally sensitive. By focusing on protecting the parts of the Arctic that are the most environmentally sensitive while still allowing for drilling to happen in other areas, it is possible to reach a best of both worlds scenario where Alaska can still reap the economic benefits while at the same time protecting important species. It is clear that there is a need for an economic development policy in the Arctic that will help local communities while also serving to further establish American presence in the Arctic. One such proposal can include large-scale investments in Arctic infrastructure, including building new icebreaker ships that can increase Arctic accessibility, oil spill training for local communities, and expanded Coast Guard personnel transportation. Icebreaker ships in particular are a key component of any sort of Arctic strategy because they are pivotal to maintaining access into the region, which is good not only for the military but also for scientific excursions and oil spill recovery efforts. Currently, the United States has only one heavy icebreaker ship and one medium icebreaker ship. In order to remain competitive with other Arctic nations and to maintain a secure access to the region, an expanded and refurbished icebreaker fleet is necessary. The government should also require that more royalties from oil leases go directly to indigenous and local communities for the purposes of building schools, hospitals, libraries, and roads. Because these communities are most at risk in the event of an oil spill or other disaster, they should be the ones benefiting from the oil drilling that happens in state waters near their shores. Moreover, by financially supporting local communities, there can be a more harmonious relationship between all the Arctic actors. Finally, we recommend increasing investment in research into oil spill cleanup technologies and encourage the state of Alaska to streamline the regulatory process for chemical dispersants that are allowed to be used during the event of an oil spill. As you can see, there doesn't have to be so much of a conflict between environmental interests and development interests. On the right-hand side, you can see that there are some biologically sensitive areas that are very important in the Chukchi Sea. These areas are important for bird migrations, and different whale and seal species use these areas for mating and migration as well. However, on the left-hand side, you can see the areas where the most petroleum potential are. Notably, the majority of the area with the highest potential of petroleum is not part of one of these environmentally sensitive areas. While there is some overlap, given that there's plenty of space in these non-environmentally sensitive areas, there's no reason why drilling should have to happen in those biologically sensitive areas in the first place. Investing in increased Arctic infrastructure would not be cheap. Refurbishing an existing icebreaker costs around $200 million, and building a new one costs around $850 million. Nonetheless, there are several political forces at play that can make it a more feasible policy. Firstly, Republicans are generally averse to increased government spending on most things, but many Republicans are in favor of military spending because they want to appear tough on national security. By framing an increased investment in Arctic infrastructure as a matter of national security and of keeping up with Russia, Republicans will be more likely to be on board with such a policy. Democrats are also likely to be on board because an upgraded icebreaker fleet will allow for safer and more frequent scientific expeditions to the Arctic. Policies to increase investments in local communities are also likely to gain Democratic support due to recognition that these Arctic communities are especially vulnerable to climate change. Moreover, the potential for icebreakers to allow rapid oil spill responses and recovery will be especially reassuring. Increasing government spending also creates jobs, which is a popular bipartisan goal. Defense industrial manufacturing that would benefit from investing in icebreakers is a popular industry that many politicians, especially the president, are seeking to focus on. And finally, government spending creates a multiplier effect in the economy that results in wider and stronger economic growth. In the event of an oil spill, there are several responses that can help clean up the spill. Notably, Alaska currently does not have any pre-approved oil spill risks to using chemical dispersants. They can be a useful tool to minimize an otherwise catastrophic oil spill. Chemical dispersants work by breaking up the oil at the molecular level and turning the oil into little droplets that can easily be diluted and dispersed by the water. Oil spill recovery, however, is also an area that could really benefit from innovation. Increased investments in cleanup technology, especially in universities, could lead to breakthroughs in oil spill recovery technology and minimize the risks of oil drilling. There are many oil spill cleanup technologies in the pipeline that have been developed since the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. Researchers at the University of Michigan are developing a smart filter that can filter out oil but allow water through. Other new technologies include an oil-absorbing tube made out of fibers from milkweed plants developed by the Canadian company Encore 3, which absorbs oil twice as fast as conventional polypropylene absorbents. Increased research funding can help make these and similar technologies cheaper, as well as fund the development of frontier technologies, such as the microsubmarines under development at the University of California, San Diego, that absorb oil droplets and transport them to a collection area. Moreover, an expanded Coast Guard presence will be pivotal to cleaning up and containing oil spills. With increased Coast Guard personnel and a new icebreaker in the Arctic, there will be increased ability to use new cleanup technologies, including nets to collect oil and disposition of dispersants. It is clear that there are a variety of economic benefits to Arctic oil drilling. An economic study analyzed that Shell's oil exploration program alone could generate around 1.5 thousand jobs and $120 million in wages. The total economic output of such a program would generate $312 million. An important part of our policy, however, is to make sure that these economic gains benefit the communities that are most at risk from a potential disaster. Local communities stand to benefit immensely from increased royalties from oil companies. This money is often used to build schools, hospitals, and transportation infrastructure that really makes a difference in the lives of these communities. It is also important to note that there's often a lot of local support for oil and gas exploration amongst local communities. For example, the Arctic Inupiat Offshore is a new company based in Alaska and is owned by 6 native corporations that seek to increase offshore oil and gas drilling in Alaska. Ultimately, our policy proposal lays out a series of programs and strategies that aims to ensure a sustainable and prosperous U.S. Arctic region. While there are serious risks to Arctic offshore oil and gas exploration, it is possible to do so in a way that minimizes that risk, protects the environment, while at the same time bringing important economic benefits to local communities. Our policy proposal includes investments in Arctic infrastructure and communities, especially icebreaker ships, to make the Arctic more accessible and ensure that communities are benefiting from profits made by companies. We also propose targeted environmental protections that focus on the specific areas and species that are most at risk. Finally, we propose increasing investment and research into new cutting-edge oil spill cleanup technologies that, although ideally will never be used, could prove themselves invaluable in a time of crisis. The broader goal of our policy proposal is ultimately to make sure that the Arctic is a region that works for everyone, not just for one specific interest or another.